The heavy air of St. Jude's Children's Hospital in New Orleans suffocated Miguel. In the stillness of the early morning, a chilling shiver ran down his spine. Suddenly, the ground trembled, a metallic groan echoed, and in his mind's eye, the pediatric wing collapsed, burying children and medical staff. He felt the dust and the muffled screams of lost lives, a visceral premonition that froze him in time. Miguel, 45, a night janitor, of medium height and shoulders slumped from years of labor, awoke gasping in his small janitorial room, the smell of disinfectant and ether still clinging to his nostrils. The dream seemed so real. The images of the pediatric wing collapsing, the despair of buried children, and the figure of Nurse Sarah, 30, with brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, and eyes always tired but kind, trying to shield a small patient, haunted him. Sarah was one of the few people in the hospital who always treated him with respect, a glimpse of humanity amidst the cold routine. That image tormented him. He knew the hospital, an early 20th century structure with its ancient brick walls and labyrinthine corridors, had been experiencing serious structural problems. There were deep cracks in the walls of the third floor, where the pediatric wing was located, and dark moisture stains on the ceiling, a constant reminder of neglect. Rumors persisted that the city council had ignored engineers' warnings about the building's safety, focusing on more visible projects in the city. The urgency propelled him out of the makeshift bed. His footsteps echoed through the empty, silent corridors. Only the hum of machines and the flickering emergency lights, which pulsed erratically, guiding him. The thought of more innocent children buried pressed down on him, an unbearable weight on his chest, a pain he couldn't ignore. He felt a moral obligation to do something, even if it was madness. That night, Miguel, in an unthinking act of desperation and driven by a deep conviction, attempted to sabotage the support columns of the third floor. His plan, though radical, was to cause the collapse in a controlled manner, perhaps during the day, when the pediatric wing would be empty for an emergency renovation, thus saving lives. He used rusty tools he'd kept from his youth when he worked in construction, a past he rarely spoke of, guarding it like an intimate secret. As he hammered and painstakingly excavated the column bases, the grating screech of his tools broke the funereal silence of the hospital, which seemed to absorb all sound. Sweat streamed down his forehead, mingling with dirt, adrenaline pumping through his veins, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, a bright light blinded him, and the deep voice of Frank, the night security guard, 55, bald, pot-bellied, and with a gray mustache that covered part of his mouth, echoed in the cold, damp corridor. "Miguel, what are you doing here at this hour?" Frank was known for his inflexible routine and his suspicious gaze, always patrolling the corridors with a powerful flashlight. Miguel tried to stammer an explanation, something about urgent maintenance and building safety, but the tools in his hands and the marks of his effort on the columns exposed the truth. The premonition had pushed him to a dangerous limit, and now harsh reality imposed itself. He was fired the next morning, without explanation, only the disapproving glare of Frank and the contempt of the hospital director. Miguel left, carrying the overwhelming burden of his failure and the unsettling certainty that fate, or death, as he preferred to think, had not given up on him. Miguel returned to his small apartment in the French Quarter, New Orleans, a labyrinth of narrow streets and colonial architecture that exuded history and mystery. The sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine and the salty breeze from the Mississippi entering through the half-open window brought no comfort. The dismissal was a hard blow. The humiliation still burned in his veins. But what truly suffocated him was the persistent image of the premonition, the sight of children and Sarah beneath the rubble. Death, to him, wasn't a hooded figure with a scythe, but a cold, insidious presence, an invisible shadow, an aura of inevitability, an echo from the hospital's shadowed corridor that now followed him home. He felt its footsteps, a constant chill on the back of his neck, as if a cold breath brushed his skin. He tried to distract himself, turning on the old tube television, which buzzed before displaying the blurry image of the local news. The news spoke of the imminent arrival of a tropical storm named Echoes, promising strong winds and torrential rains for the coming days. The storm's name sent a shiver down his spine, a chill that went beyond the cold. Echoes, like the echoes of his dream, like the echoes that seemed to haunt him, a cruel irony of the universe. The apartment, usually his safe and quiet haven, now felt like a tight cage, the walls slowly closing in. With each violent gust of wind that battered the wooden window, Miguel recoiled, his body tense. He closed his eyes tightly, seeking peace, a moment of relief for his tormented mind, but it refused to settle. He needed to escape somehow, any way he could. Death wouldn't catch him, he promised himself. He thought of leaving the city, going somewhere far away, perhaps west, to start anew in a place where the past couldn't reach him. That night, the rain began to fall, heavy and constant, drumming on the window with a monotonous, oppressive melody. The air grew colder, damp and heavy, laden with the smell of wet earth and the electricity of the storm. Miguel felt trapped, claustrophobic. He rose from the worn sofa, walked to the window, and watched the flickering city lights through the curtain of water that formed. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, a faint, almost imperceptible sound began to make itself known. It was a sound that shouldn't be there. It was the echo of a child's toy, a sound he had heard in his dream, the sound of a baby rattle. He felt his heart pound violently in his chest. Death, he thought, was playing with him, a cruel game. The sound of the child's rattle, subtle and persistent, seemed to come from within the very walls of his apartment, a macabre echo that resonated in his tormented mind, an extension of the premonition. Miguel turned abruptly, his eyes sweeping the small space in desperation. His mind, already fragile and exhausted, began to play tricks on him, blurring reality and hallucination. He clung to his sanity, desperately seeking a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the upstairs neighbor. But there were no children living there, only an elderly couple. The sound grew clearer, closer, more insistent, as if the rattle were in his own hands, vibrating in his bones. The rain outside intensified, creating a somber soundtrack that accompanied the accelerated and irregular beat of Miguel's heart. The air in the apartment grew dense, the temperature dropped drastically, and a damp chill seemed to penetrate his bones, making him shiver uncontrollably. He felt like a cornered prey, death, his invisible and relentless hunter, tightening the noose with each shake of the rattle. He needed to escape, not just the city, but that oppressive presence that suffocated him. The apartment door, his only apparent exit, seemed to promise a new beginning, a reprieve. But as he extended his trembling hand to the cold doorknob, a chilling thought struck him. Where would he go? Death didn't care about borders. It would find him anywhere. Miguel recoiled, his eyes fixed on the door, as if it were a portal to the unknown. He felt the overwhelming weight of a choice that seemed not to be his, of a predetermined fate. Stay and face death, or run and prolong the suffering. Run where, if death was already there, in his home? The sound of the rattle grew louder, more insistent, transforming into a child's lament that pierced his soul, echoing the voices of the children in his dream. He covered his ears with his hands, closing his eyes tightly, trying to drown out the sound, trying to erase the image of the child in his dream. But the macabre melody seeped into his mind, a constant and painful reminder of the premonition. Miguel was trapped in a labyrinth with no exit, and death was his guide, the conductor of his destiny. The rattle's lament became a shrill whisper, a dissonant and unsettling melody that filled every corner of the apartment, tightening the air around Miguel. He felt suffocated. Each breath was a painful effort, as if the oxygen was being sucked from the room. He opened his eyes, and what he saw paralyzed him, the blood chilling in his veins. On the opposite wall, the faint flickering street light, distorted by the rain, cast a dancing shadow, which, for a fleeting instant, unmistakably took the form of a child's toy, a rattle swaying gently. It was an illusion, he knew, a trick of the light and his mind exhausted by sleep deprivation and stress. But the sight filled him with a primal terror, a fear that froze him. Death was not just pursuing him. It was mocking him, playing with his sanity. He staggered away from the wall, tripping over his own feet, his body trembling and uncoordinated. His heart pounded erratically, like a runaway war drum in his chest, announcing an imminent end. The air smelled of mold, dampness, and a strange, almost sickeningly sweet sweetness that turned his stomach, an odor he recognized from the hospital, an ominous presage. It was the smell of death, he thought, a smell he had associated with the hospital in his dreams, with decay and the end. Miguel felt on the verge of an abyss, one step away from madness. He had tried to trick death at the hospital, had tried to flee, but it was relentless, omnipresent, faster than him. "You won't get me," he whispered into the void, his words lost in the insistent, mocking echo of the rattle, a silent scream of defiance. He looked at the window, the only source of light in his now dark and oppressive apartment. The storm outside had intensified. The winds howled like hungry ghosts, and the rain beat furiously against the window panes, creating a watery barrier. He felt a strange attraction to the window, an irresistible temptation, as if it were a call. Was death inviting him out? Miguel knew it wasn't an invitation to freedom, but to another trap, different from the one at the hospital, but equally fatal. He had to resist, to fight against this morbid attraction. Death was cunning, but so was he, and he would fight until his last breath. Miguel collapsed onto the worn sofa, exhausted, his body heavy and his mind boiling, desperately trying to ignore the ghostly sound of the rattle that continued to echo, now seeming to come from all directions. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the vivid images of the premonition replayed in his mind like a horror film. The breaking beams, the suffocating dust, the muffled screams of the children. He felt the overwhelming weight of guilt for not having been able to prevent the tragedy at the hospital, for having been fired and discredited. This guilt, he thought, was death's most potent weapon, undermining his sanity, surrounding him with his own fears and regrets. The apartment seemed to have shrunk, the walls closing in around him, closer and closer with each passing moment, suffocating him. The sickly sweet smell of death intensified, making the air almost unbreathable, dense and nauseating. Miguel felt feverish, his body sweating cold, his skin bristling, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He needed fresh air, an escape, anything to get him out of that mental and physical prison. He rose from the sofa, stumbling, determined to leave, to break the siege. But before he could take a step towards the door, a current of cold, biting air swept through the apartment, making him shiver. The window, which he swore he had closed and locked, was now slightly ajar, invitingly. The rattle sounded louder, clearer, distinctly from the street, an irresistible invitation. Death, in its insidious persistence, seemed to whisper his name through the window crack, a macabre melody that called to him. Miguel approached the window, hesitating, his body rigid. He knew it was a trap, the most treacherous of all, but the morbid curiosity and the desperation to find a way out were forces too powerful to resist. He pushed the window open, and the gust of wind hit him with brutal force, making his small body sway. The rain, propelled by the strong wind, splashed his face, cold and cleansing. Outside, on the dark, wet street, he saw something small gleaming in the middle of the sidewalk. A sign. The gleam in the street called Miguel, a faint but persistent light amidst the darkness of that stormy night. It was a tiny object, yet it seemed to emanate a light of its own, almost supernatural, in the gloom. The sound of the baby rattle was now distinct, clear, coming directly from that luminous spot on the sidewalk. Against the howling wind, which seemed to carry whispering voices with it. and the incessant rain that lashed the asphalt, Miguel felt pulled by an invisible force, a magnetic attraction. Death was there, he knew, waiting patiently for him, using the perfect bait to draw him into its cold embrace. Morbid curiosity mingled with the desperation to end that torture, and he couldn't resist the call. He opened the apartment door, the creak echoing in the empty hallway, and rushed down the stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath his feet. The smell of sea air and wet asphalt filled his nostrils, but the sickly sweet smell of death persisted, now stronger, more intense, as if it emanated from the rattle itself, permeating the air. On the dark street, under the flickering, intermittent light of a street lamp, the object shimmered. It was a baby rattle, made of colorful plastic, vibrating gently with the wind, an almost angelic glow. Miguel bent down to pick it up, his trembling fingers brushing the cold, smooth plastic. He heard a whisper, indistinct, a childish, ethereal voice, but it seemed to come from the toy itself, or perhaps from inside his own head. The world around him seemed to distort, the city lights stretching and merging into colored blurs. The asphalt beneath his feet seemed to become soft, unstable, like quicksand, giving way with every touch. The rain suddenly stopped, an abrupt and deafening silence, and the wind quieted, as if nature itself hushed for the moment. In place of the storm sound came the distant and melancholic echo of children's laughter, and the soft lament of a lullaby, a melody he had heard before in his dream. A feeling of lightness enveloped him, as if he were floating, his body becoming ethereal. He felt a gentle, but irresistible, pull into the void, into the darkness. The rattle slipped from his fingers, falling into the darkness beneath the lamppost, its glow vanishing. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and final. His freedom was, in fact, merely an illusion. The echo from the shadowed corridor had reached his door and covered him with a veil of eternal peace.